In the 1970s, Ireland was one of the poorest countries in Western Europe, largely agrarian, real incomes that lagged its neighbour across the Irish Sea. But then over the next few decades, the Irish economy started to grow much faster than the UK. It was helped by joining the EEC, attracting inward investment and the growth of large-scale farming enterprises. But what really supercharged Irish growth was an ultra-low corporation tax rate. In 1997, the corporation tax rate was cut to 12.5%, which gave Ireland a huge competitive advantage over other European countries. Now, whilst the headline rate was 12.5%, in practice with all the exemptions, the effective tax rate was closer to 4%, with the European Union claiming that the likes of Apple were given an effective corporation tax rate of just 1%. This low tax rate was particularly appealing to American multinationals who could avoid paying US tax by shifting their intellectual property to Ireland. It didn't matter if the goods were not produced or consumed in Ireland. It was just an effective accounting trick. The effect was to supercharge Irish GDP growth. Now, it is important to bear in mind American investment wasn't just about accounting tricks. It did lead to real investment and a real growth in jobs. In 2017, US firms were directly employing 25% of private sector jobs. They paid 80% of Irish corporation tax and paid nearly 50% of Irish income tax, partly due to the fact they offered much higher salaries than was typical. The investment from America also had a knock-on effect to other parts of the economy, such as creating a boom in financial services. In particular, accountants who could offer innovative ways to avoid paying corporation tax have been in particular high demand. Ireland has one of the world's largest flows of BEPS, which is base erosion and profit shifting. It's bigger than the entire system in the Caribbean, which is noted for its tax havens. Now, this is all great for increasing GDP, but the growth in Irish GDP is deeply misleading to the economy that ordinary people in Ireland actually experience. Between 2007 and 2022, Irish GDP per capita increased by 87%. Gross national income increased by 53%, and modified GNI, the measure preferred by the Irish government for giving a better reflection of the economy, increased by just 10%. Also worth bearing in mind, the population increased a lot, so per capita growth much lower than actual increases in GDP and GNI. Without getting too technical, modified GNI excludes all the accounting tricks which inflate GDP but don't translate into higher living standards. Actual individual consumption increased only 7% in this period, and that is what really matters to your actual living standards. During the Brexit debate in the UK, there was a famous quote where a Leave voter heckled an economist saying, "It's your GDP, not mine." Nowhere is this statement actually more true than in Ireland. If we look at Irish GDP per capita, it's an amazing €99,000. GNI per capita, 71,000, and modified GNI, 54,000 per capita. And again, the best measure of living standards is what can you actually buy. And here, Ireland is one of the most expensive places in Europe, second only to Switzerland, and nearly double the EU average. This graph shows real expenditure per capita adjusted for purchasing power parity. What can you actually get? On this measure, Irish living standards are actually lower than the UK and Italy. Also, there's something of a two-speed economy in Ireland, with the average salary from American multinationals around €85,000, but a domestic industrial job just 35,000. Eurostat estimate that in 2022, the top 20% of income earners in Ireland took 15 times the market-based income of the poorest 20%, and this is the highest rate of market income inequality in the European Union. Though it is important to bear in mind that the Irish tax and benefit system does much to reduce this inequality. After taxes and benefits, it's much closer to the EU average. But this still doesn't take into account housing costs. Nowhere is the cost of living crisis more acute than when it comes to housing. Rents have soared, especially in places like Dublin. The average monthly rent is over €2,100 a month, which is equivalent to the take-home pay of a teacher. With rents becoming unaffordable, there's been a rise in the number of people evicted from their houses, an increase in homelessness to around 75,000. Home ownership rates have fallen. Not surprising given that house prices to income ratios are close to 8. But it raises the question, how can you have such a bad housing crisis when GDP per capita is north of $100,000? Well, many reasons. Firstly, like the UK, since 1973, Ireland has been selling off social housing to the private sector, but not replacing it. 58% of new homes for rent in the private sector comes from global investment funds, which have concentrated on the more expensive properties. Thirdly, whilst corporation tax is low, tax on rental income is either 20 or 40%, and this has either reduced supply or landlords passing it on to renters. Landlords also complain about expensive new regulations. But perhaps more importantly, fourthly, during the boom years of the early 2000s, it precipitated a housing speculative bubble. House prices soared and it caused a surge in house building. But when the financial bubble popped, it hit housing very badly. House prices fell 50% and the house building sector was hit very hard. It has never really recovered. Despite failings of the private sector, the government has been unwilling to invest in new houses. For example, government policy has been more focused on attracting multinational firms to come and invest. For example, they've given priority to enable them to buy land in desirable places, but at the cost often of land for housing. Now, just recently, the EU's highest court ruled that Apple must pay back the Irish government €13 billion in back taxes. But the Irish government didn't want it. What's going on here? Whilst the UK squabbles over a fiscal black hole and is trying to cut winter fuel allowance for pensioners to save £1.6 billion, Ireland seems to be swimming in money, a rare budget surplus in the developed world, an embarrassment of riches. Yet at the same time, young people have been leaving the country because of the cost of living. Surely, if you have a housing crisis, why not use the budget surplus to invest in building affordable homes, or at the very least, housing benefit to help pay rent? The government's argument is that with the economy close to full employment, there aren't enough workers and resources to build more houses. Now, this is a slightly strange argument in that during the housing boom of the early 2000s, it attracted many migrant workers from Eastern Europe to help build. If the will is there, then the resources can be found. Perhaps a deeper reason is a fear of repeating the mistake of 2008, when a reliance on housing construction and tax revenues from the financial and housing boom then led to a spectacular collapse in government revenues, big budget deficit, and then the painful austerity of the post-2008 years, an austerity, by the way, which fell mainly on lower income households. Now, low tax was not the only reason that multinationals have been attracted to invest in Ireland. It does have a unique position as an English-speaking country with good access to the single market, even more powerful since Brexit. Ireland also has strong historical ties with America due to past immigration and the number of Irish Americans. It meets many of the criteria for a stable economic and political situation. But at the same time, if you take away low tax, Ireland does not rank particularly well on other economic metrics. The ranking for foreign direct investment attractiveness is not particularly great, and there's nothing special about the World Bank's last competitiveness index. Ireland ranked just 24th. Even since Brexit, it hasn't really attracted that much investment from financial firms who prefer to go to other capital cities like Frankfurt and Paris. And perhaps the biggest problem of all is the cost of living in Ireland is an economic cost too. It's making labour markets more inflexible and a shortage of workers, especially in the fastest growing regions of the economy. So the Irish government is definitely concerned that the gravy train of being an effective tax haven may be becoming to an end. The US has started to reform its tax system, giving less incentives for companies like Apple to shift profits abroad. There's also growing pressure for a global minimum corporation tax rate of 15%, which will reduce Ireland's competitive advantage quite a lot. Now, during the financial crisis, Ireland saw a large rise in public sector debt. But if we use debt as a percentage of GDP, like most statistics use, then Ireland looks quite low. But of course we have to remember this is misleading. If we look at Irish debt, GNI, as the Irish government uses, it's much higher. Now, despite the discrepancy of GDP, the statistical anomalies, the Irish economy has made reasonable progress in recent decades. Living standards have definitely increased, even if it's much less than headline figures suggest. But it could definitely do much better if it could only sort out its housing crisis. Still, I think it is fair to say that in the past 2 decades, Ireland's still done better than the UK economy. The UK has really struggled to get over the issue of Brexit, which has caused many economic problems for the UK economy. This video goes into the story behind Brexit and why it is now regretted by so many. Do check it out, it is worth seeing.